Hello and welcome to After the Sermon, a Bethany podcast where we have the privilege of digging deeper into our Sunday messages. I am Tami DeLau, and if you are watching us, you are noticing that we're missing our partner in crime, Steve.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So Pastor David Baxley is here with me. I have to confess, I feel sadness. So you are going on a sabbatical, the second half of your sabbatical.
Yeah.
And we will miss seeing you for about 8 weeks. So
I'm gonna miss being here again. The first one was great and first half of it during the summer but I will admit, I've told my wife this too. This is the second half is the one I've really been looking forward to, having kind of the holidays just for us as a family and half of it Desmond being in school. So Amy and I can just have some alone time.
Which is awesome.
Just the two of us, which I'm really looking forward to as well.
So at first I was excited for you because the passages you gentlemen have been doing are like hunks of verses, like 15, 20, 22 verses. And so you have like a handful of verses.
Yes.
But it's about slaves and masters.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
something that we can't even really fully relate to. So I'm going to go ahead and read those verses so we get people on page with us. So you are in Ephesians 6, 5-9, if I'm correct. Okay. So here we go. I'm reading out of the CSB version. I want to call it the David version, but that's probably not appropriate. All right. But it says, slaves, obey your human masters with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart as you would Christ. Don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing God's will from your heart. Serve with a good attitude as to the Lord and not to people, knowing that whatever good each one does, slave or free, he will receive this back from the Lord. And masters, treat your slaves the same way, without threatening them, because you know that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So I did not have the privilege of being part of our service development team on Tuesday because I got to be a mom and do Sam's last conference. I can't believe our baby is a senior. And so I feel like I really missed something because we get to unpack. So
we get to wrestle through the text as a team.
So I feel like those listening to us and watching us today kind of have the privilege to see a little bit of that because as we walk through it. So the studying that I did do, first of all, so many Bibles, if you're looking at a study Bible, they just skip this handful of verses. They just don't even want to deal with it. Okay. The ones that do deal with it, though, really take this text and they apply it to, because we're always looking for application because we're Americans and we want to know what we're supposed to do with it. And we forget that this was not written to us, but for us. And they do employer relationships. And I know that you wrestle with that interpretation a little bit.
I do.
And so help me understand why you wrestle. So, because I didn't get to be part of hearing, I think you're absolutely right. I'm not going to argue with you about that, but I need you to know that I've been taught.
And so have I.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely. One of the things we'll talk about in the message is two things that this passage is not meant to do.
Right.
And this is the other one. The other one is not meant to endorse slavery either. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. I think the reason I wrestle so much with that is I think it minimizes what this text really is doing. When we understand the culture of this that Paul was writing to, when he writes to a slave and says what he does, he is writing to someone that is the property of a person without much to any option of ever removing themselves from that scenario. He is writing to someone that is considered not even human by the culture which they live in. Even at the chance they have a quote unquote good master. We chatted about that earlier.
We did talk about they still have a master.
They have a master and they are still less than, they are property. And so I think what happens is when we try to take this text and we try to put it onto employer-employee relationships, we minimize what this text is. This isn't like, how do you work in difficult situations? How do you figure out how to process someone that's not treating you well? Because whatever experiences we have in that context, especially at work, we have the option to quit.
I can quit.
To report.
And even if we quit, we can collect unemployment. So it's a different.
Yeah, if we're fired, we stand up. We stand up. If we quit, we can find another job. And that's not to minimize, because there's some people that just so desperately need a job and the income isn't as good. So I don't want to minimize those hard things. But even the worst case of those scenarios is not what Paul was writing to. A better way of understanding this, Paul was writing for how do Christians respond to fully, not just accepted systematic injustices of people created in the image of God, but how we are to respond in a world where we can't do anything to undermine or we can't do anything to change the injustice. We can't change the laws. We can't fix the problem. It's so foreign to us in our American culture, which I'm really grateful we have that. In a sense, the fact that this can easily be watered down to the context you said speaks beautifully to the freedoms and the power that we do have,
the luxuries that we have.
The luxuries that we have that I'm grateful for. And yet to minimize it to that, if you were to take this text, one of our study Bibles that makes it about that employer relationship, and we were handed to missionaries who are doing work in Africa with tribes that are warring each other, taking each other as slaves and captive, or even some things in other parts of the world that practice slavery still as it exists, and then we'd make it as employee relationships. But they're going to look at it whoever the commentary that wrote that, it totally can't see what this is really about. And a lot of our missionaries, they walk into these cultures, they don't have the ability to change the laws. Right. They don't have the ability to do those things. I think they would understand that's not what this text is about.
So I know Paul doesn't condone and say it's okay to have slaves, nor does he condemn and say it's wrong to have slaves. I think that's hard for us because we want to sign a petition. We want to vote. Some people think Paul's a mean guy. Like, why didn't he go in as a Christian and change it? Because our God can change the world. Yeah,
that's a good. So, I think what I would respond when someone says Paul it doesn't condone, but also doesn't condemn, I maybe would challenge that idea a little bit.
Okay.
And here's how I would maybe challenge the idea. What Paul does condemn in his instructions who's he writing to? He's writing to Christians. He recognizes that there is no system to which the Christians, those that are choosing to follow Christ, those that now see the world through the lens of the gospel, that see it radically different, they don't have any power to come in. They can't write a letter to their local, Roman emperor representative and say what's wrong with this scenario. So
I won't vote for you.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So
Paul's lack of communication with instructions of what to do in a context of a free society like we have should not, I don't think, go as far as a way of saying that it is condoning slavery, because
yet there are people who said that. I mean, it's been used both ways.
Absolutely. There. That is. Boy, I feel like that. That's another whole can of worms we're trying to speak to right now.
There's so many ways we can do.
Let's even put a pin in that, potentially come back, because I just want to address this one tension. Because you're right, people use that. And so now let's look again through that lens of the Bible was not written to us but for us. So what was he saying to those he was written to? What if you were to look at what he says to the masters, and masters, treat your slaves the same way without threatening them, because you know that both their masters and yours is in heaven and there's no favoritism. That statement alone undermines everything the master had the right and privilege and power to do in the culture that was in. So slave culture, the culture of slavery, the laws of slavery said the exact opposite of everything here. So he was saying to you, Christians, that have power, Christians that have, because the slave didn't have any power. He can't write to the slave and say, you have power, here's what you should do differently, in the sense of using power to change something. But he can write to a master and say, you don't have a power to change the law. You can't change the way the culture sees this in this situation from a macro level. But in your life, this is to radically change and be different in this way. And I think what he does in undermining all the laws that gave the master power, Paul is indirectly, or maybe even directly, undermining slavery in itself. Because later on in our own history, though there have been Christians that, I'm going to put Christians in quotes, there are people that have used the Bible to try to use a text like this. See, Paul didn't condemn it. It shouldn't be condemned.
It's okay because he's talking to slaves and masters, so there can be slaves.
Yeah, so this must be okay to do. That denies what Paul was doing in what he wrote here to the masters. And when Paul writes what he does here, he undermines the entire system, and no longer do I treat you, act like, or even engage with you as if you were a slave. So there's the power. Slavery is built on power. And that's ultimately, in fact, we're getting into this whole household code section.
Yeah, which we need to hit that too.
Yeah, and Steve's going to come back and talk about this in regards to husbands and wife and children and parents and all that. But the root of this is all of these areas that Paul's going to address are ultimately rooted in power. Who had the power to control, to manipulate, to get people to do what they wanted to do. And sometimes power is culturally given, even if it's not legally given. Yet in Roman culture, all of these household codes were legally given. So the husband and wife dynamic was not just a, hey, how do we want to approach our marriage? How do we want to see it? It was a law this is how it was supposed to be, parents and kids, and now slavery as well. So when a master began to change how he treated, he removed the power. When Paul says in this text, without threatening them, he has removed power. You are not to have any power on them, over them. And here's the deal. At this point in time now, if a slave doesn't do what I want him to do, what am I going to do?
He's removed the power.
It would be like
a policeman.
No, he says you can't beat them.
Yep.
You can't do the things. Excuse me. You can't do the things you once did. And so in doing that, with that, whoever's willing to submit to the Bible, who's ever willing, because of the gospel, allow their life to be radically changed, he has condemned slavery. He has condemned the way we approach and treat people. You are no longer allowed to see them the way the law allows you to see them. You're no longer allowed to treat them the way the law would allow you to treat them. So even though the law could not be changed, by doing what he did, he condemned slavery as it was practiced for the life of every Christian.
Because when he took the power away, he was condemning it.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So I know that not everyone can see my hands, but I think what we have heard is you've got master and you've got slave here. And somehow we wanted to believe that Christianity brought us up on this same level. The truth is we were brought here because Jesus is our master. We're all slaves.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the bottom line at the end of the day.
At the end of this, Paul is not... And we're going to talk about this more in the message, but at the end of the day, Paul was not lifting slaves up to equality as a master.
No, he
is bringing masters down to equality with a slave,
yep.
Which is... That's where, that's how you see Paul undermining the system of power.
Okay.
You see Paul undermining and condemning. I want to say this again, directly, indirectly, however you want to think about it.
Okay.
He is to the reader this was written to, condemning the whole model, condemning the whole way they treated each other, and saying because of the gospel, you are to see yourselves both as slaves, but to a different master, to Christ.
So I know it's been fun having you go to seminary because you'll have books and you'll kind of slide them my way. And one of those that you did was reading scripture through Western eyes.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
This is a perfect example of that, isn't it? Because we don't have this dynamic within our culture.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I think that's what leads us to create weak connections to our culture. You know, if you hear someone preach this text and be like, hey, whatever you do it to the Lord and not for humans. Well, that's correct. And that's mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, even outside the context of slavery. So it's not that that's an unbiblical message.
But it's not found in these handful
of verses. Not the point of this. This is writing against something that exists that is systematically unjust, that is morally depraved, that the way they treated each other was rooted in a moral depravity that denied the very idea that someone could be created in the image of God, or in their culture, a God, right? Like all that is gone. And so the depravity and the injustice that is represented in slavery can never be compared to something we would understand in a dynamic of any type of, I guess I don't know if we have anything that even comparable in our culture, United States. And that's what makes it so hard. And we have to be really careful when we go to the Bible, recognizing this truth that we don't create application that is not there, but there is application still for us. It's how do we think and respond against injustices that we have no power to culturally change or undermine.
Okay, so how do we do that? I mean, because we see injustices. So it's I don't even know how to say this. He's telling them not to be bitter here. Is that part of the equation? Like, there are injustices. We still serve the Lord. We still...
Yeah, I think
it feels like it's a call to not be bitter.
And this is, again, I think this is why this is so hard for us, is it? Because even as you're saying this, Tami, I know what you're saying is correct. I know that's what this text is doing, but my own cultural, I have so many ingrained ideas, we all do, of rights and freedom. And if there is an injustice, you fight against that injustice and you go against it, which I'm not saying is wrong. No. We have that ability to do that. So don't hear anything we're saying here.
We're not saying not vote. We're not saying
exactly. And we're not saying that when those rose up to stop slavery historically in the United States, we're doing the wrong thing. Absolutely not. That is not what we're saying in any way whatsoever. But we're saying that when we experience injustices, and it's so hard for us to understand, I don't know if it's hard for me to imagine scenarios where this might be the case because we have so much ability to do things. But when injustices take place, it is our role, when we don't have the ability to do like we can in the United States, it is our role to still live with a heart of absolute surrender to Christ as our master, representing him in the middle of injustices. When I am treated wrongly, we can go back to even ideas of love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. When someone says terrible, and we're going back Matthew 5, 6, and 7 and the Sermon on the Mount, when someone says terrible and vile and evil things about you, don't return that. Instead, return love. Show kindness. When someone slaps you on one cheek, totally dishonoring you and totally turn the other. Like if there's any text that I think we want to bring, into this to understand,
like a cross reference.
Into that, it's going to be those incredible things that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that just challenge the very core of our existence, of self-defense, of self-rights, of self-preservation, of self-care, of self-validation. And Paul's saying, like, but your life, slave. And I don't think Paul is not saying it's not that bad. That's not what Paul is saying. No. Paul knows what he's writing to. That life still has value to God. And one of the things Paul is doing here that would have been foreign to a slave is he is giving value to the slave. When he first starts out this passage and says slaves, and he speaks to them first, he is lifting them up.
So even the order of operations speaks.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So when he even says in verse 8, knowing that whatever good you do, it's rewarded. Slaves had no value. They would not get rewarded. They weren't there. They could expect nothing. Like, again, as an employee, if I do work, I'm going to get paid. The truth is I can get paid for doing crappy work, or maybe I can even hope for that raise or that opportunity. That slave could do as good a work as he possibly could. There's no reward. There's no, hey, here's 5 days off. Here's extra vacation. We're moving your tier 2. You're going to get that promotion. Like, none of those things were this expected reward for doing things. But what Paul is doing, he's saying, even though you are a slave and even though your master, and I think in this case is not even a believer, even though the master may not.
I know when we had talked earlier, it really is like they are working, feeling like there's a knife being held to their throat. There was that much power that the master would have had.
That's right. It wasn't just he could beat you. Your property. Yep. You can throw your property away. You can burn your property. You destroy it, sell it, and move it on. There's like, it's, the knife to your throat is such a good example. So he's writing them saying, like, I can't fix this. If I go back to that scenario, potentially writing to a brother or sister in Christ that may be in another country that is, where they're a slave. Right. What would I tell them? Rise up, pull your people together and revolt? Maybe, but also maybe not. That may not be the thing to write to them. That may not be the thing. That may not be what God is going to use in their lives to show the gospel. He's writing to them and saying, even the worst scenarios, you can show the gospel. And not only when you show the gospel by how you live, that you will be rewarded. but maybe not on earth.
Because your real master is watching.
Because your real master is watching. And we're again, because comforts are so readily available to us, and we have the ability to fight for our own rights and fight for our own power. Even the idea of heaven being the only ultimate justification of anything that could ever happen in our lives feels, again, still so foreign to us.
Right.
Because
we have a summer vacation.
Yeah. And I can sue somebody that does an injustice to me, and I can take them to court, and I have a pretty good chance of winning, and none of that existed. And so he's pointing them and saying, God will reward. God is just. Every injustice done towards you, God will make justice done towards you. That may not happen until eternity, but justice will happen. Right will happen. Reward will happen to you. And you are of value to God. God will reward you. And this is, again, the blowing away moment in this text. God will reward you, slave, on the same way he would reward any other person, because you have equal value. And in fact, we're affirming, created in the image of God. We're affirming that in this text in a way that other culture would have never even considered in that moment.
I mean, for those in the church, because we know Paul had both slaves and masters are within the church.
Yeah, this is the craziest part of this text.
What if you're a slave and your master isn't a Christian? And so now Paul is saying, obey your master.
And that's
we don't know what that looked like, and it could have looked horrific.
Yep. And we see stories of like this. I think of the story of Esther. Mm-hmm. We often have a great Sunday school version of the story of Esther, but let's consider this for a moment. A Jewish woman who was seeking to live holy and pleasing to God, mm-hmm. who was at this point
a virgin.
Was a virgin, mm-hmm. who was knew the laws of God to not intermarry or have anything mm-hmm. with foreigners, though she was in a foreign land, was ripped out of her home by the king, along with however many women, right. dragged off to the palace to be pampered in preparation.
Right.
To be the object of sexual pleasure for the king, so that when her time would come for that one night, she would, without any choice in the matter, to the point of death, the same way a slave would have been, mm-hmm. which is now at this point, she's more like a sex slave in this mm-hmm. dynamic, taken before a king, sent to his bedroom for whatever he wanted, right. whatever, and then at that moment would either be cast away or not, depending on the will or the...
But her life is forever changed.
Mm-hmm. And forever owned now mm-hmm. by this king, belonging to her. And we look at the life of Esther, and at least for me, my favorite verse of this, well, maybe God brought you to this place for such a time as this. Mm-hmm. But think about what's all surrounding that. It's
hideous.
It's hideous. And, mm-hmm. and we don't think about that. We have the Sunday school.
The VeggieTales version is way sweeter.
Oh man. Yeah. The VeggieTale version. Tami, you're right. We picture mm-hmm. the VeggieTale version, even as adults, mm-hmm. whether we admit it or not, realize it or not, we picture that. And so when Mordecai says, maybe God brought you into the palace for just such a time as this, that's more what the slave maybe God has saved you for just such a time to show God's gospel or his glory to an abusive, evil man mm-hmm. or an abusive, evil master. Actually could have been men or women, or even honestly, the children of the masters had power over the slaves.
So this is fun, because you know me, I love to connect the different Bible mm-hmm. verses. So we've got Esther. Now let's talk Onesimus.
Yep.
So Onesimus is a slave, runs away from Philemon, comes to a saving relationship with the Lord. Mm-hmm. Paul sends him back to mm-hmm. Philemon. Was he sending him back to be a slave again?
Yes.
He was.
He was. And people will sometimes use that to, again, Paul's endorsing slavery. Mm-hmm. And so again, just to hit that tension mm-hmm. that's right there. At this point, Philemon is running for his life. Mm-hmm. He has broken the laws. And anybody finds him.
There's a reward.
Dismiss running for his life. And anybody finds him, mm-hmm. they can kill him. Okay. It's done. It's over. Paul,
and he would have deserved that.
Oh yeah, rightfully so. Like anybody could just, you're a runaway slave. Here's your throat. It's gone. Like mm-hmm. it's done. And now Paul is sending him back as a part of saving his life. Mm-hmm. So when he sends him back to this, but the way he tells him to be received is, Paul writes this. He says, okay, but when you receive him, don't receive him as a slave. Mm-hmm. but more than a slave, as a dearly loved brother, especially for me, and even how much more for Christ, both in flesh and in the Lord, since I'm confident of your obedience. And who is the obedience to Christ?
Obedience
not to the laws, not to the rules, not to the power that you have. Confidence you're obedient. I'm writing to you, knowing that you will do even more than what I am saying. And so he writes this letter. He doesn't undo slavery because, again, not an option right now. That's not what the scenario is going to allow for to happen, but to undercut it so that the relationship dynamic doesn't exist as a slave anymore. Okay. The way they can live with each other is no longer slave and master, but as brother and sister in Christ. Paul is removing the power, but yet,
he's not changing the dynamic.
Paul reminds us of this in 1 Corinthians. He's like, whatever position God finds you in, see where God has put you in that position, and then use it for the kingdom and use it for God's glory. We are so used to, like, if I don't like this, there's got to be a better. God would never. It's the lie we tell ourselves. God would never want me to be unhappy. It's right up there with God helps those who helps themselves, or cleanliness is next to godliness. God would never want me to be unhappy. Not biblical truths. But we spout them as if they are. But yes, they're not reality. And it's because we have the ability in our culture to make them our reality, because I have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what my culture tells me. And we have an entire document we have framed that tells me I have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And because in that same document, it says you are given this by your creator, we assume that must be in the Bible somewhere, because we might know the Declaration of Independence better than we actually might know the Bible. And it's not actually what the Bible is telling us what our life is. In fact, he's saying you are all slaves to your spiritual master, Christ. If you're a free man with all the rights and powers, you're to see yourself as a slave to Christ. And though a lot of us maybe can't identify with the slave in this passage, all of us can identify as the master, because in our culture today, we're all free men and women.
We're our own king.
We all have the power. We are told by our society, you are valuable because you have power and you have rights and you have privilege. And he's saying, don't see yourself as one that has power and has rights and has privilege. Instead, see yourself the same way that slave already knew they were. That's one of the crazy things he says. As masters, treat your slaves the same way they are treating you. He's like, boom. You are to see yourself like them and know that both of your master is in heaven. You both have the same master. You're both at the same place. God has no favoritism. And we don't like to think about it like this, because the prosperity gospel just poisons the brain of so many of us without us even knowing that it's seeping in. But the gospel is not about our prosperity. It's about the gospel's prosperity. It's about the name of Jesus being proclaimed.
Jesus' glory, not
and
my
he
glory.
is our master. And in Christ, there is no favoritism, because we're all slaves to Christ. We all belong to him. And you know why? And the Bible's full of this language. I was purchased out of being a slave to sin.
But we have
not to be a slave to Christ, to be a slave to righteousness, to be a slave to living according to the gospel and a new life.
But our master is good.
But our master is good. And, I want to give Josh credit, because we were chatting about this week, and I appreciated that a lot, as he kept saying, we have to remind ourselves we have a good master. And though that feels so cheap when we might say a good earthly master, because slavery is so
ugly.
Yeah, rightfully so. It's a good thing to say I have a good spiritual master, because he's my master and my father, because he cares for me like a son, but I'm still called to live obedient to his calling no matter what he asks of me.
So if we wanted to tie this in a pretty bow, which I don't know that we can tie this in a pretty bow, at the end of the day, all of us need to see ourselves as slaves to Jesus, a good master. And that we may face things in our world like Paul faced, where we see an injustice and we can't do anything about it because we can't change, but we see God and we serve God in wherever he has us. Is that feel fair? Like, I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not incorrect at all. I think the important thing is that we need to see this as our response to the
injustices,
in moral, ethical, systematic, whatever you want to say, injustices that surround us in our world. And I think if we begin to step back a little bit, we can probably see where they still exist in our world today, right? We know they're there. We're still, there are people that because of their skin color, because of their wealth or lack of wealth or whatever it is, that still experience injustice toward them. I mean, however great it is, people can still be bribed. There's corruption. Like this still exists in the United States,
Absolutely.
even if not nothing close to what this was, nothing close, but still it exists. And there are people that still suffer under injustices and oppression and things like that. And to know that when I've exhausted my ability, which I think we should use to fight against those injustices. Right. When I've exhausted my ability, the gospel brings me back to realize, but ultimately I am a slave to Christ, that he is my master and I have no power, but God has the power. And the other thing that's sweet about this is that it, in bringing us to the same place, I can look at my brother and sister who maybe seems to have more privilege, or maybe seems to have more power and have more money. Money's power, right, or whatever it might be, and it should challenge me to not respond in jealousy and frustration and anger that they have what I don't have, but to see them as God's servants, that God has blessed them with something for his glory, as much as God has called me to my situation for his glory. And it also reminds those of us who might have what so many others don't have, that we are to bring ourselves down and see ourselves only blessed by God with this place. And how I respond to it is to demonstrate that I'm a slave to Christ, a slave to righteous. I am poor in spirit. For, like this is, again, coming back to Sermon on the Mount is such the beautiful, maybe way to go back and read all that Jesus said. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness when they can't eat really food because there's not available to them. All these things that are in contrast there. Well,
there's a humility that comes with knowing that we are slaves, and it's a good humility.
And the humility is before Christ, and when we have real humility before Christ, it becomes easier to humble myself before others, even when they are unjust, immoral, unethical, because I know that who my master is, he will advocate for me in his will and his timing, and he will reward and he will do what is good, even when I don't see that on earth.
Well, I think we need to be done. I'm going to miss you, so I won't cry, but I'm excited.
No, it's
for
okay. You can cry. I'm cool with it. No, go for it. Yeah, it's all good.
So Steve will be bringing our message next week. Yes. He'll be in Ephesians 5. We're going to jump back into Ephesians 5. Yep. And so
continue
I think those
on
are verses
with the same
22,
household codes we were talking about. Yeah,
I think those are going to be verses 22 through 33. If you want to read ahead, thank you for joining us. Have a great week. Bye-bye.